My name is David Pickering, and I am professor of music at Kansas State University. Today I'm going to be talking about the Gleason-Crozier Legacy, and icons Harold Gleason and Catherine Crozier use their gifts as teachers, performers, and scholars to contribute significantly to raising the standard of organ performance and teaching in the United States. Just a little bit about their biographical background. Harold Gleason was born in 1892, about an hour northeast of Cleveland, Ohio. His father occupied a variety of middle-class professions, and eventually the family had to move to Pasadena, California when Harold was 8 because his father contracted tuberculosis. And fortunately, his father never recovered from the disease and died shortly before Harold's 17th birthday. The family lived in very modest circumstances at that time. His mother had to take in boarders to their home, and Harold had to work very hard for all that he had. He eventually studied engineering at Caltech and then left that to pursue music, a career in music. He had not had much formal musical training when he was younger, and so he totally immersed himself in piano studies and in the study of the organ. He eventually married Marion Norris in 1915 and worked as the organist at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California, before he moved to Boston to become director of the Boston Music School Settlement, then moved to New York to become the director of music at Fifth Presbyterian Church, and then eventually moved to Rochester, New York in 1919, where he became the house organist for George Eastman, and in 1921, one of the founding faculty members of the Eastman School of Music, where he founded the organ department. His contacts during this time period, particularly with Linwood Farnham and Joseph Bonnet, were very valuable and key to the formation of his ideas in both teaching and performance. Bonnet, for example, introduced him to some of the early music written for the organ that was of pre-Bach in nature, and also even included music outside of the typical German and French time periods of that time. He eventually had established his career as a teacher, most notably at Eastman, and by the early 1930s, Catherine Crozier, who had been studying in Pueblo, Colorado, was recommended to go to Eastman by her teacher, Mabel Stockus. Catherine had also come from a modest background. Her father was a Presbyterian minister. The family moved around, eventually settling in Pueblo, Colorado, and she had the fortune of having a good grounding in both organ and piano with Miss Stockus, and eventually, due to the family's financial circumstances, Catherine was sponsored to go study at the Eastman School of Music by a benefactress, Lillian Thatcher. Catherine progressed rapidly during her studies at the Eastman School of Music. She was awarded the Bachelor of Music degree, Performer's Certificate, and Artist's Diploma, and eventually also earned the Master of Music degree in Music Literature, became a member of the Eastman faculty in 1938, and the next year, Harold had determined that he wanted to end his relationship with Marion, and that divorce was finalized in 1940, and Harold and Catherine were married by her father in 1942. So in talking about the pedagogical philosophies of Harold Gleason, particularly that is cemented in his method of organ playing, which was first published in 1937, will be published in 7 other editions, the last being published in 1996, 16 years after his death. Catherine, of course, oversaw the publication of these last couple of editions before her death in 2003. Harold later noted, he said, "I just didn't feel that the organ methods that were available to me at the time when he was teaching were very helpful, and he said they were not adequate for the kind of teaching that I wanted." And partly, he said, because of Joseph Bonnet's influence. He says, "In Bonnet, I could see what was required of a first-class organist for the first time. The method of organ playing was an outgrowth of Bonnet's influence, which incidentally was transmitted through Jacques Lamont and Charles-Marie Vidor, and the fact that I did not have a method that I found I could use." Orpha Oxy, who studied with Harold from 1948 to 1953, noted key elements of the French technique that the Gleasons taught to students. She noted in general, movement by the performer was controlled and limited, fingers close to the keys and no unnecessary gestures while playing. As far as pedal technique was concerned, knees were together, touching when the feet were an octave or less apart. Both knees and heels were together for intervals up to a fifth. Ankles were turned toward each other so that the shoe soles met the pedal key on the inner side rather than flat on top. Feeling for gaps between pedal black keys was frowned on. Pedal and manual scales were a part of regular practice using the various patterns shown in the last part of the method. 2-octave manual and pedal scales were always a part of semester juries. When a Gleason organ student was assigned a new piece, the first task was to borrow an annotated copy from either Harold or Catherine, and to copy the fingering and pedaling markings the Gleasons had inserted. All Gleason organ students used the same fingering and pedaling, and all was based on the principles found in the method. Catherine was really the epitome of the method itself. She was Harold's most famous student, and her technical foundation, coupled with her driven work ethic and demanding personal expectations, really set the foundation for her success. She was also willing to completely consecrate her life to the organ, and was supported in this by Harold, who didn't want her distracted in any of the kind of activities of the mundane, everyday nature that would distract from her practicing and her work. Catherine later related that she only practiced about 3.5 hours a day, contrary to stories that others have said. She undertook a lot of correspondence, even though she was under professional management, with various hosts and presenters for her concerts. She prepared very assiduously for lectures and master classes, and so she wasn't just locked to the organ console all day, but she was consistent and, of course, had her teaching and other duties. Really, Catherine was primarily a performer, and I think even though she enjoyed teaching very much, she seemed to thrive the most when she was uninhibited with her teaching, and that did not detract from her work as a performer. However, as a teacher, she was exceedingly thorough, probably even more thorough than Harold himself. Sylvia Hamilton noted that during the first years of a student's undergraduate career, no aspect of musical interpretation was democratically determined. Crozier supervised all aspects of the playing. These included choice of repertoire, fingering, pedaling, the amount to be learned at any one time, the order in which parts of the piece were to be learned, and the way that a work would be interpreted. So she was very, very controlling in that particular way, much more so than maybe a lot of teaching today. Orpha Oxy describes Harold's teaching as very even-tempered. She said, "I never knew him to speak in an angry manner. If a student asked a silly question, his answer might be sarcastic or funny, but not impatient. He was kind to students who made mistakes if he thought they were genuinely trying. On the other hand, there were no excuses. Rochester weather could be brutal, but it never stopped the Gleasons from being at school for lessons, and the students were expected to be there on time." Wilma Jensen, in later years at Eastman, noted that even though she had been studying with Catherine, she had studied with Harold for a couple of weeks while Catherine was on tour, and she was supposed to play the Fantasy in G minor of Bach. And so she had worked out a method of doing this with Catherine. She had then worked with Harold, who then suggested some differences. And when Catherine later came back to coach her, she said, "Who put all these metronome markings in this music?" And Wilma said, "Well, Dr. Gleason did." And Catherine went up and erased every single one of them. And she said, didn't say anything, but she just went up and erased all of them. Janice Beck, from Catherine's years of teaching at Rollins Collins in Orlando, Florida, also indicated that Catherine was very thorough, very attentive in her teaching, and, interesting phrase, left nothing to chance. She expected your best, Beck indicated, and you were compelled to give her your best. I think that is a very important thing for a teacher to do, and I've never forgotten it. Beck believes that the Gleason technique was one reason why Catherine herself was able to play for such a long time, so beautifully. And Beck later indicated, she said, "I have never found a piece, if I thought about it carefully and approached it properly, that I could not play. And I contribute that to the Gleasons." Catherine's career spanned nearly 70 years and really up until her last few years of life. She embraced a wide variety of organs by builders. Primarily, the organs of E.M. Skinner and Aeolian Skinner were the ones that she played most frequently as a recitalist. She performed nearly 700 recitals over the course of her career. And as times changed and Aeolian Skinner organs fell out of favor and eventually out of business, she embraced even mechanical action, and two of her most famous organs in later years were the Markison organ at Wichita State University and then the Rosales organ at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Portland, Oregon. And so she had very eclectic, wide-ranging tastes. Her taste in literature was very broad, even from the very beginning of her career, and most can definitely attribute this influence to Harold and his wide-ranging taste as well. She had a thorough grasp of styles and musicality from various styles and eras and periods, just as Harold had, and no doubt the two had worked for years together to study this music together and eventually to share that with the world. And although Harold and Catherine had no biological children from their marriage, the musical descendants who have come to know their work and standards number in the thousands as they continue the great quest of making music for the King of Instruments. Thank you very much.